Hey guys, our next subject that we're looking at, our next unit study is injuries to the tissue. So I'm going to go through the intro of that today. Just bear with me, I have my kids in the other room, so if they come in and disturb it, that's just what it's going to be. Okay, so the stuff that's in this unit is an overview of body components from cells up to organ systems. Look at cells and body tissue, the types of different body tissue we have, uh, some kind of a rehash of the general principles of bleeding control. That's what we're going to look at today. That's why it's in yellow. The rest of it, soft tissue injuries, um, how we treat that. Same with looking at muscular system, joints, and skeletal system. We'll look at what they do, how they move, the different function of it, the specific injuries, and how we treat them. Okay, so start with the overview of body components. Now, we take this from small to large, which is looking at cells at the very smallest level, all the way up to organ systems. So, cells are examples, things like nerve cells, like a neuron, a muscle cell, or epithelial cells. Now, when you get a collection of like minded cells all together, serving a function or a purpose, call that a tissue. So, you have muscle cells making up muscle tissues. Then, when you get enough of a tissue, we start to call it an organ. So that would be, like lungs, heart, or brain. And then, when you get a group of organs all working together to do something, we call that an organ system. The best example of an organ system would be the digestive tract or the digestive system. Because there's what, 9 organs with that, with the mouth, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, rectum. Yeah, so 9. So that's a collection of organs that all serve the same purpose. Okay, if we look at cells first, this is the smallest unit of sustainable life. Basically, it's the smallest structure that's capable of performing all the activities vital to life. So within a cell, you have a bunch of different things. We call them organelles that do a variety of things to sustain your life. Each cell is made up of cytoplasm or protoplasm, which is basically the kind of the goop in the middle of the cell that holds everything together. Everything sits inside of it. It maintains the cell's shape and keeps everything. That's the word I'm looking for. Keeps everything in its right place. So that's called cytoplasm or protoplasm. Now, within that, you have all the cell organelles that all serve different purposes, like the endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi body, mitochondria, RNA, nucleus, all of that. Now, that should be review for you. So we're going to take one class period just to label the organelles of a cell with like a one sentence explanation of what their function is. So you should have done that in bio as a freshman, or some of the other bio classes I know cover that. The last thing with a cell is the membrane that holds it all together. That is made up of what's called a lipid bilayer, which is really important. It's described as semi-permeable because it basically chooses what it lets in and out. And it's this lipid bilayer. Without going into too great a depths, the hydrophilic, hydrophobic ends is what really controls the passing of certain things in and out. Okay, um, so that's what you'll do tomorrow is basically look at all of those cell organelles and label them on a diagram. I'll have the cell drawn out. You don't need to draw anything with just, a one sentence explanation of what they do. Okay. Did I skip one? No, I didn't. Okay. So now when we get cells together that are similar, serve the same purpose, we call it a tissue. Now, in between the cells, we'll talk about that in the next slide. So basically, there are 4 major categories of tissue: epithelial, connective, nerve, and muscle. So we'll look at each of those individually. But before we get to that, in between the cells, you have fluid. Okay, so we have this fluid It's primarily water. It's called interstitial fluid. It does contain some electrolytes or ions like potassium and sodium, um, but it kind of keeps the structure, the overall structure of that tissue. Now, if you get a change in the amount of fluid in the tissue, that can be problematic in both situations if we don't have enough or if we have too much. If we have too little fluid, that's basically what happens when we get dehydrated. We lose that interstitial fluid, and we have feelings of thirst, your dry mucous membranes, such as dry mouth, but also in the nose and eyes and other mucous membranes that we have. And you're also going to feel tired. If you have too much fluid, we're going to get edema, which is basically swelling. So I have a couple of pictures of what that looks like. So the first one is, this is called skin turgor. This is somebody who is dehydrated. And basically when you pinch the skin, it stands up rigid like that. And you can see they pinched it and it left stood up afterwards. That's a sign of somebody is pretty dehydrated. On the opposite side, we have edema, which you can see in this picture, a difference between the size of the legs. This is swollen with lots of fluid in between the cells of the muscle tissue and the fat tissue and the skin tissue there as well. You can see on this side, this is what's called pitting edema. Just basically you push your thumb into the leg and it leaves a mark. I think we talked about that when we looked at the secondary survey. Okay, so we'll look at the first type of tissue. That's epithelial tissue. Basically, this is skin and the lining of all the cavities of the body and the principal tubes, passageways that exit the body. So that would be the inside of your nose is lined with epithelial tissue, the inside of your mouth, the inside of the other end. All of that is lined with epithelial tissue. The kind of two major things that epithelial tissue does is it protects internal organs. So obviously our skin is a protective coating, and the insides of our inner passageways protect what's on the other side of them. Epithelial cells help control temperature. The epithelial tissue will move blood supply away from the skin or towards the skin as we need to control temperature. Okay, as blood goes towards the skin, we lose heat. As the blood is held inside, we hold on to it. The type of injuries that we get to epithelial tissue are, usually traumatic. So that means there's trauma involved, which isn't mostly when people think of trauma, they think of how you feel, but basically trauma just means an injury. Okay, so something has hit, torn, broken that tissue. So things like abrasions, lacerations. So abrasion is a rubbing injury. Laceration is a cutting injury. A puncture is a poking or stabbing injury. Avulsion is a flap of skin being torn off but not completely separated. Epithelial tissue primarily impacted by that, but infection, inflammation, and disease can also damage this tissue as well. Okay, next tissue is connective. Basically, this provides the framework for most organs. It connects, supports other tissue, and we look at two major types, which is soft connective tissue and hard connective tissue. So if we look at soft first, we have some examples here. Adipose or fat tissue. This is subcutaneous, meaning it's just below the skin surface. You have the epidermis, dermis, then subcutaneous. This is where the adipose or fat tissue is held. The primary function of this soft connective tissue is it's a food reservoir where we can store energy. It's an insulator. It helps keep you warm. And is an energy source that's really tied into being a food reservoir. Other types of soft connective tissues we have are tendons and ligaments. They are fibrous in nature. That means they have strands all going in the same direction. And they support the joints of our body and help connect certain structures together. So the two connective tissues here that are soft are tendons and ligaments. So tendons connect muscle to bone. Like the gastrocnemius is connected to the calcaneus or the heel via the Achilles tendon, the most famous tendon. And then ligaments connect bones to bones. Okay, so ligaments in all of your joints. There'll be ligaments going across the joint to connect it, and in multiple directions. Okay, so the more complicated the joint, usually the more ligaments that are there. So the knee is a large hinge joint. It will have 8 major ligaments connecting the bones going across. Okay, sort of 2 on the front, crossing, that's your ACL. 2 on the inside of your knee, that's the MCL, medial collateral ligament. LCL, lateral, and it would be posterior cruciate ligament, PCL, on the back. Okay, we also have hard connective tissue. That's bone and cartilage. Bone or osseous tissue. This is obviously what makes up our skeletal system. That should be straightforward. Cartilage serves kind of a variety of purposes. It's dense, solid, elastic. It's hard, and it's really smooth as well. So this is found in all the movable joints that we have. It acts as a shock absorber as kind of the joint hits, but it also is really smooth to allow the joints to move past each other without catching. So the meniscus in your knee is cartilage, and usually when people have a tear in the meniscus, it kind of, as the knee moves in flexion, the meniscus catches and then suddenly it releases. And that's why you have that discomfort and pain with somebody who has a torn meniscus in the knee. As well as being in joints, we also find it in other parts of our body. It kind of provides the shape for things like nose, ears. So it is solid but movable. The larynx as well, excuse me, which is your voice box. Okay, the next type of tissue is nerve tissue. This is the third one. This is comprised of nerve cells, which are called neurons. And basically, they are there to carry information between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So that's brain, and the brain spine is central. The rest of your body is peripheral, and it works both ways, taking information from one to the other and back again. Now, your nerve tissues can be damaged through minor bruising. That's what a contusion is. It's a bruise where we get short-term damage to nerves, where there can be impaired sensation or impaired ability to move what has been bruised. So like if you get a really bad bruise on your leg, it suddenly feels stiff. So you have lower nerve function to be able to control the movement there as well. If we get major injuries that crush or sever nerves completely, that can cause pretty serious long-term injuries. Nerves are really hard to fix. So if you get severing of the nervous system in the spine, that's going to lead to paralysis, depending on where it is. If it's high up on the spine, it's going to lead to quadriplegia, loss of all limbs. If it's below the arms, paraplegia, which is just loss of legs. Okay, and this is a classic example of a nerve cell. This is a neuron with sort of tentacles coming out. Those are called dendrites. And then the long axon coming away here, which is where the nerve signal is passed along to. Okay, last thing is muscle tissue, the last of the four. So your muscles have tiny fibers that are able to contract and slide past each other. Should have seen this diagram before. So this is what's called a sarcomere, or a muscle unit. And basically you have this fiber sliding past the yellow fiber, changing the overall length of the muscle. So as it contracts, they slide past, shortening the muscle. Okay, so I'm not going to flex my biceps, but basically that's what happens. That muscle's getting shorter as the muscle fibers are sliding past each other. And then as it extends, they slide back the other way. We have 3 major types of muscle tissue, which is skeletal, cardiac, and smooth or visceral. Okay, so we're going to look briefly at those. Skeletal muscles, these are striated under the microscope, which means striped. They attach to bone and they permit movement. Okay, so all of the major muscles of the body that you should know, like pectoralis, abdominals, quadriceps, biceps femoris, gastrocnemius, all of those are skeletal muscles. Okay, they cause movement of the skeleton. And these are under your voluntary control. Okay, so you have complete control over your body movement. Like you can tell your arm, your bicep to contract. You don't really do it, you just kind of think it and it happens. The other two types are not under your conscious control. Okay. Second is cardiac. Cardiac muscle is kind of a hybrid. It's striated or striped in nature, but it doesn't behave in the same way as skeletal muscle because obviously it's not attached to the skeleton. And what is different about cardiac muscle is it can continue to contract constantly. In fact, your cardiac muscle never really rests. It contracts, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. I think something crazy like 100,000 times a day, and it doesn't tire out. Okay, most of you, after doing 20 push-ups, those muscles start to fatigue and fail. Your heart does not fail in the same way. Okay, and again, so you don't have true voluntary control over your heart rate or your muscle contraction. Now, you can slow your heart rate down by being still, but really you're controlling the cardiac muscle by controlling your skeletal muscles by limiting their movement, which is different. The last is smooth or visceral muscle. This is, again, not under your conscious control, and this lines your organs. Probably the best example of smooth muscle is what lines your digestive tract. You basically get these rhythmical contractions to push food down your esophagus and along your small intestine. This rhythmic contraction of muscle that moves it. Okay, it's called peristalsis. All right. Okay, so this should be some review for you because we spent a whole lot of time practicing controlling bleeding. I want to just look at a couple differences between the types of bleeds that we can get. Okay, so firstly, we can have internal bleeding versus external. Internal bleeding is where there is a break in the blood vessel inside of your body. So blood is leaking into your body, into the spaces between your organs, but doesn't come out, so you don't see it. This is normally caused by blunt trauma. Okay, so blunt trauma is the difference between a punch is blunt, that's not going to tear the skin, as opposed to a knife that stabs, that breaks the skin. So blunt trauma is where you hit something hard with something that's wide or diffuse. And basically that dispersed pressure can squeeze internal structures and cause them to rupture under that pressure. And internal bleeding can be really, really bad and dangerous because you're not always aware of it. You cut your finger, you see the claret, the red coming out. You know you need to deal with it. But if you have an internal bleed, you aren't necessarily aware. External bleeding is a tearing in the skin, opening up of arteries, veins, or capillaries. Now, this is in order of severity or seriousness. Capillaries is the least severe. External cut to a vein is more, but not as bad. And an arterial bleed is by far the worst. Okay, so capillary cuts, these are the most common that we see, where you get a slow leaking of blood. It can be controlled with a pad, just a pad on and a little bit of pressure, or even a Band-Aid. Okay, that can stop it depending on how wide or open the cut is. If we have a venial bleed, that's a little deeper, what's going to characterize that is the color of the blood and how it behaves coming out. Okay, so the blood in your veins is darker in color. It's more maroon because it doesn't have oxygen in it. Okay, when oxygen combines with the hemoglobin, it produces this red color. So it's dark maroon. It oozes out. Okay, so it won't be a fast bleed, but it will be continuous oozing of blood. It usually takes about 6 minutes of applied pressure to stop a venial bleed. Okay, so now so I know some of you are in HOSA. Some of the instructions for controlling these bleeds is to hold pressure for 6 minutes before you even think of bandaging. In my background in EMS, it was always hold and bandage at the same time because everything's about moving on and moving quickly. Okay, so it is appropriate to stop a venial bleed with just applied pressure and waiting for the blood flow to slow and then bandaging up afterwards. But just from my experience, why wait? Why wait? Because you can bandage and apply the same pressure with a bandage. The last and most severe is bleeding out of an artery or an arterial bleed, this is bright red because of the oxygen, and it's going to spurt out. So it will pulse out, and this can be dramatic. It can be spurting out at a reasonable distance. These have to be controlled immediately because these are severe. Depending on where that, if it's the artery in the arm, it's going to come out fast. But if it's the artery in the leg, if it's your femoral artery, if that one gets, torn, that one is going to be lights out for a lot of people pretty quickly. So it must be controlled immediately to prevent shock or worse. The worst is death. Okay, I think this is the last one. Something just flashed on the screen, so I wonder if I'm being cut off. We'll see in a minute. The last thing is pressure points. If you do have an arterial bleed that you can't control, the first thing you want to do, so say it's on the arm, you want to elevate it. And then if applying direct pressure is not stopping it, what you can do is apply indirect pressure, which is basically at a pressure point. So if I had a bleed here, I can squeeze on the brachial artery here where you took pulse and slow the flow of blood into my forearm, making it easier to stop. And that will be one of your class activities in a couple of days, will be to label all the pressure points in the body. All right, that's it. We did not get invaded by my children. You can probably hear them in the background watching Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. They will probably make an appearance at some point. All right, thank you guys, and I will speak to you soon.